So glad you're back. You're going to love today's story.
Charlotte Foster laughed as she deliberately tipped her flute of vintage champagne over Elaine Foster's modest silk blouse in the middle of the crowded gala. The pale gold liquid bloomed across the fabric, a cold, sticky shock against Elaine's skin. Around them, the hum of the city's elite faltered for a heartbeat. Socialites froze with hors d'oeuvres halfway to their mouths, their eyes darting between the two sisters. "Oh, Elaine, I am so sorry," Charlotte said, though her voice carried the sharp, performative edge of a woman who was anything but. She didn't reach for a napkin. Instead, she handed her empty glass to a passing waiter without looking at him, her eyes locked on her sister's ruined outfit. "I suppose I'm just clumsy today. But then again, that blouse was doing you no favors. It's a bit utilitarian for a Foster Foundation event, don't you think?" Elaine Foster didn't flinch. She felt the dampness seeping through her camisole, the scent of expensive yeast and sugar clinging to her. She looked down at the stain, then back up at her sister. Charlotte stood there in a gown that likely cost more than a mid-sized sedan, her hair a perfect architectural feat of blonde waves. She was the family's crown jewel, the influencer with 3 million followers who curated a life of effortless grace, while Elaine spent her weeks in the cockpit of a King Air, flying through whiteout conditions to pull hikers off mountain ledges. "It's fine, Charlotte," Elaine said, her voice low and steady. It was the same voice she used when the turbulence hit 10,000 feet, calm, detached, and utterly controlled. "It's really not fine," Mrs. Foster said, appearing at Charlotte's side like a shadow. She didn't look at the champagne dripping from Elaine's hem. Her eyes were fixed on the potential for a scene. "Elaine, dear, go to the powder room and clean yourself up. You're drawing focus for all the wrong reasons. This night is about the Foundation's expansion, not your wardrobe malfunctions." The dismissal was practiced. In this room, under the glow of the crystal chandeliers that smelled faintly of beeswax and lilies, Elaine was the invisible guest. She was the daughter who flew planes, while Charlotte was the daughter who built brands. Ethan Foster hovered a few feet away, shifting his weight. He caught Elaine's eye, a flash of genuine sympathy crossing his face before he glanced at his wife, Charlotte, and retreated into the safety of his scotch. He knew better than to intervene when the Foster women were marking territory. "I'll go," Elaine said. She turned, the sound of her sensible heels a dull thud against the polished marble, a stark contrast to the sharp, aggressive click of Charlotte's designer stilettos. As she walked toward the corridor, she heard Charlotte's voice rise, projecting to the nearby circle of donors. "She's just so sensitive lately. I think the isolation of those mountain flights is getting to her. It's a noble little hobby, of course, but it doesn't exactly prepare one for high society." Elaine stopped near a towering floral arrangement. Her hand went to the small, waterproof bag tucked into her waistband, hidden by the cut of her blazer. Inside was her satellite phone and a ruggedized tablet. Only an hour ago, it had buzzed with a restricted notification. She reached in and felt the cold, hard casing of a thumb drive she'd pulled from her flight suit earlier that morning. It contained the cockpit black box audio from yesterday's rescue mission in the North Cascades. The mission the media was calling a miracle. The one where a pilot had landed on a literal knife edge of ice to rescue a 10-year-old boy who had wandered away from a luxury ski resort. The boy was Walter Henderson's grandson. Walter Henderson, the man currently sitting at the head table, the man whose multi-billion-dollar aerospace conglomerate was the primary benefactor the Fosters were trying to court tonight. The Fosters didn't know it was Elaine. They didn't know because the Blizzard Angel always flew with a visor down and refused all interviews. They didn't know because they never asked where she was when she wasn't at their dinners. Elaine checked her reflection in a gilded mirror. The champagne stain was a dark, ugly blotch, but her eyes were clear. She took a deep breath, smelling the ozone and cold air that still seemed to cling to her skin despite the perfume of the gala. She saw Charlotte in the reflection, holding court near the stage, gesturing wildly as she told some fabricated story about her latest, humanitarian trip to Bali. Charlotte was a creature of the light, of the lens, of the surface. She had no idea what it was like to hold a life in her hands while the wind tried to tear her out of the sky. Elaine pulled out her phone and sent a single text to a contact labeled Walter H. I'm at the gala. I have the flight data you requested regarding the extraction. The reply was instantaneous. I'm in the VIP lounge. Come now. I've been looking for the person who saved my family all day. Elaine tucked the phone away. She didn't go to the powder room. She didn't try to scrub the champagne from her clothes. Let the stains stay. Let it be a reminder of exactly who Charlotte was. She began to walk, not toward the exit, but toward the restricted elevators. As she passed the main bar, she saw Charlotte watching her, a smirk of triumph playing on her lips. Charlotte thought she had chased her sister away. She thought she had won the night by ruining a piece of silk. A label didn't smile back. She didn't need to. She knew the layout of this building better than Charlotte did. She'd studied the blueprints when she'd consulted on the rooftop helipad requirements. She reached the elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse level. Just as the doors began to slide shut, she saw Mrs. Foster leaning in to whisper something in Charlotte's ear, both of them looking toward the spot where Elaine had just been standing, their faces twisted in a shared, condescending laugh. They were so sure of their world. They were so sure that status was bought with dresses and followers and the right kind of champagne. Elaine felt the elevator surge upward. The pressure in her ears changed, a familiar sensation. She reached into her pocket and gripped the thumb drive. Tomorrow, the Foster Foundation was supposed to announce a massive partnership with Henderson Aerospace. It was the deal that would cement Charlotte's husband's career and fund the Fosters' lifestyle for the next decade. But Walter Henderson didn't reward people who treated his heroes like dirt. And he certainly didn't reward people who lied about their charitable nature while bullying their own blood in public. The elevator chimed. The doors opened to a quiet, wood-paneled hallway that smelled of expensive tobacco and old money. At the end of the hall, a pair of heavy oak doors stood open. Elaine stepped out, her stained blouse a badge of honor now. She wasn't just a pilot, and she wasn't just the invisible sister. She was the one holding the keys to everything Charlotte Foster wanted, and she was finally ready to turn them. The air in the Henderson Aerospace ballroom was thick with the cloying scent of white lilies and the rhythmic, predatory clinking of crystal against crystal. It was the sound of old money welcoming new influence. Elaine Foster stood just inside the heavy oak doors, her pulse a steady, rhythmic thrum against her ribs. She didn't look like she belonged. Her blouse was still damp with the red wine Charlotte had accidentally tipped onto her an hour ago, the stain a jagged, dark map across her chest. What on earth are you doing here? The voice was a sharp blade, cutting through the ambient hum of the room. Charlotte Foster stood 10 feet away, her silk gown shimmering under the chandeliers like oil on water. She didn't wait for an answer before she was across the marble floor, her heels clicking with the precision of a firing squad. She looked Elaine up and down, her lip curling in a display of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Did you take a wrong turn at the service entrance?" Charlotte hissed, her voice low enough to stay under the music, but loud enough for the nearby investors to turn their heads. "Look at you. You look like a stray that's been dragged through a gutter. This is a $5 million partnership launch, not a charity soup kitchen." Elaine didn't flinch. She felt the hard, sharp edge of the thumb drive in her pocket, a small weight that felt heavier than the entire building. "I'm here to see the deal through, Charlotte, just like you." "The deal?" Charlotte let out a short, jagged laugh that drew more eyes. "You aren't even a footnote in this family's success. You're a pilot for a failing rescue outfit in the middle of nowhere. You fly a tin can through snowstorms for a living. You don't have a seat at this table." Mrs. Foster appeared then, drifting over with a glass of champagne held daintily between 2 fingers. She didn't look at Elaine's face. She looked at the stain. Her disappointment was a physical thing, cold and suffocating. "Elaine, really," her mother sighed, her tone dripping with the exhaustion of someone dealing with a recurring nuisance. "Charlotte is right. You're making a scene just by standing there. If you had any respect for your sister's hard work, you'd slip out the back before the press arrives. Go back to your little hangar." "She's right, Elaine." Ethan Foster stepped up behind his wife, though his eyes didn't hold the same venom as Charlotte's. He looked uncomfortable, his gaze flickering toward the wine stain and then away. "Today is about the foundation. It's about the legacy Charlotte has built. Maybe it's best if you just head home." The enablers had formed their circle. It was a familiar formation, one Elaine had lived with for years. Charlotte was the star, the influencer, the face of grace and charity. Elaine was the invisible one, the girl who disappeared into the clouds and only returned with stories of survival that her mother found unrefined. Charlotte leaned in closer, the smell of her expensive, metallic perfume filling Elaine's personal space. "In 10 minutes, Walter Henderson is going to step onto that stage. He's going to sign over the partnership that cements my husband's career and funds my lifestyle for the next decade. And you're going to be a memory, security." A man in a dark suit materialized instantly. Charlotte pointed a manicured finger at Elaine's chest. "This woman is trespassing," Charlotte said, her voice rising now, performing for the room. "She's been harassing my family all morning. Please escort her out before she ruins the evening for everyone." The guard looked at Elaine, then at her stained clothes. He reached for her arm, but Elaine stepped back, her movements fluid and calm. She didn't look at the guard. She looked directly at her sister. "You're so sure about this toast, Charlotte?" Elaine asked. Her voice was quiet, a stark contrast to her sister's performative outrage. "I'm sure that you're a nobody," Charlotte snapped. "I'm sure that by tomorrow, the name Elaine Foster won't even be a whisper in this city. You're a pilot. Start acting like one and fly away." Elaine reached into her pocket and gripped the thumb drive. She thought about the boy she had pulled from the wreckage in the Northern Pass 3 months ago, the boy whose grandfather was currently the most powerful man in the room. She thought about the Blizzard Angel, nickname the tabloids were obsessed with, a hero whose face they had never seen because she'd refused the interviews. She saw a man in a gray suit emerge from the side office, Walter Henderson's personal assistant. He caught Elaine's eye and paused, his brow furrowing in recognition. He knew that face. He'd seen it in the cockpit of a rescue chopper while the world was screaming. 10 minutes, Elaine whispered, more to herself than to her sister. "Exactly," Charlotte smirked, adjusting her diamond necklace. 10 minutes until I win. Goodbye, Elaine." As the security guard began to lead her toward the doors, Elaine didn't struggle. She didn't need to. She saw Walter Henderson enter the back of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd. He wasn't looking for an influencer. He was looking for the woman who saved his only grandson. The countdown had begun. The toast was coming, but it wouldn't be for Charlotte. The security guard's hand tightened on Elaine Foster's upper arm, the heavy fabric of her thrift store blazer bunching under his grip. He was a large man, smelling of peppermint and starched polyester, but he hesitated. His eyes weren't on the woman he was supposed to eject. They were fixed on the man in the gray suit who had just emerged from the wings of the ballroom. Charlotte Foster didn't notice the guard's hesitation. She was too busy basking in the reflected glow of the crystal chandeliers, her diamond necklace throwing fractured light across her collarbones. She leaned in close to her sister, the scent of her cloyingly sweet designer perfume, something called *Midnight Ambition*, filling the space between them like a physical barrier. "Don't look so surprised, Elaine," she hissed, her voice a jagged whisper meant only for her sister's ears. "You were always a footnote. Did you really think you could just walk back into this world after 3 years of playing hero in the dirt? This gala is for people who matter, people who build brands, not for girls who smell like jet fuel and failure." Elaine didn't flinch. She felt the cold weight of the silver USB drive tucked into the palm of her hand, the metal edges digging into her skin. It was a grounding pain. She looked past her sister's manicured perfection toward the back of the room. Walter Henderson was moving through the crowd now. He walked with a slight limp, a reminder of his years in the service, but his presence was like a tectonic shift. People parted for him without being asked. "The guard is waiting, Charlotte," Elaine said, her voice remarkably steady. "Are you sure you want to do this in front of everyone? Once those doors close behind me, there's no taking back what happens next." Charlotte laughed, a sharp, melodic sound that drew the attention of a nearby group of investors. "Oh, I'm sure. In 10 minutes, Walter is going to announce the new face of the Henderson Foundation's Global Reach Initiative. And after the little donation I made in the family name tonight, that face is going to be mine. You're just a stain on the carpet I'm about to have cleaned." Mrs. Foster stepped forward then, her silk gown rustling like a warning. She didn't look at Elaine with anger, which would have been easier to bear. She looked at her with a weary, polished disappointment. "Elaine, dear, please, don't make this more difficult. Charlotte has worked so hard for this moment. Your father's legacy is tied to this foundation. If you cause a scene now, you aren't just hurting your sister, you're destroying what's left of our reputation." "Reputation?" Elaine asked, her gaze finally snapping to her mother. "Is that what we're calling it now? Charlotte spent the last hour telling everyone she was the one who coordinated the relief efforts in the Northern Range. She wasn't even in the country, Mother. She was in Cabo. She provided the visibility," Mrs. Foster snapped, her voice rising just enough to make Ethan Foster turn his head from a conversation a few feet away. "In this world, visibility is the only currency that matters. Now go, before Walter sees you looking like this." She gestured vaguely at Elaine's sensible boots and dark trousers, the attire of a woman who had spent 48 hours straight in a cockpit saving lives, not a woman who spent 4 hours in a makeup chair. The guard finally took a step back, but it wasn't because Elaine had moved. The man in the gray suit, Walter's personal assistant, had reached them. He didn't look at Charlotte. He didn't look at the matriarch of the Foster family. He looked directly at Elaine. "Captain," he said, his voice low and respectful. Charlotte's smirk faltered. "Captain, this is my sister, Ryan. She's just leaving. She was just telling us how she lost her invitation." Ryan didn't acknowledge her. He kept his eyes on Elaine. "Mr. Henderson is ready for the presentation. He asked if you had the telemetry files from the rescue." Elaine felt the air in the room grow heavy, the hum of the string quartet suddenly sounding like the roar of a rotor blade. She reached out and pressed the silver drive into Ryan's hand. Her fingers brushed his, and for a second the secret power of the Blizzard Angel felt like a live wire between them. "Everything is on there," Elaine said. "The flight logs, the thermal imaging, and the audio from the cockpit when we located the boy. It's all there, Ryan, every second of it." "Thank you," Ryan said, nodding once. He turned on his heel and disappeared back toward the AV booth at the side of the stage. Charlotte stepped into Elaine's space, her eyes narrowed to slits. "What was that? What telemetry? If you're trying to sell some boring pilot stories to Walter to pay your rent, forget it. He's looking for a hero, Elaine, a face that sells magazines, not a data entry clerk." "You're right, Charlotte," Elaine said, a small, cold smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "He is looking for a hero. I think he's about to find exactly what he's looking for." Ethan Foster approached them then, his brow furrowed as he looked between the sisters. He looked at Elaine's face, really looked at it, and she saw the moment the gears began to turn. He had seen the news footage. He had seen the blurry, windswept image of the pilot who had pulled Walter's grandson from the wreckage of a downed civilian transport. "Elaine," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, dawning realization. "Not now, Ethan," Charlotte snapped, grabbing his arm. "The lights are dimming. It's time." The overhead chandeliers began to fade, leaving only the soft, blue glow of the stage lights. A hush fell over the room as Walter Henderson stepped up to the podium. He adjusted the microphone, the sound echoing through the vast space. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walter began, his voice gravelly and commanding. "Tonight we celebrate resilience. We celebrate the spirit of those who go where others fear to tread. Many have claimed to represent the values of this foundation tonight, but only one person in this room knows the true cost of those values." Charlotte straightened her shoulders, a look of practiced humility settling onto her face. She took a step toward the stage, already rehearsing the first line of her acceptance speech. She didn't see Elaine step back into the shadows of the velvet curtains. She didn't see Walter's assistant give a thumbs up to the technician in the booth. "I'd like to show you a video," Walter said, his eyes scanning the front row until they landed on Charlotte. He held her gaze for a beat too long, a look that she mistook for pride. "A video of the night my grandson was saved. Let's see who was really in the storm." The giant screen behind the podium flickered to life. The first sound that filled the ballroom wasn't music. It was the screaming of a gale-force wind and the steady, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a helicopter's blades. Charlotte froze. That wasn't the polished, filtered footage she had prepared for her social media feed. This was raw. This was terrifying. And as the camera panned across the cockpit, the face that appeared on the screen, illuminated by the glow of the instrument panel, wasn't wearing diamonds. It was wearing a flight helmet, and the eyes were unmistakable. "Wait," Charlotte whispered, the color beginning to drain from her cheeks as the room went deathly silent. That's not right." Elaine watched from the darkness, her heart beating in time with the rotors on the screen. The countdown was over. The blizzard had arrived. The silence in the ballroom was heavy, thick with the smell of expensive lilies and the sudden, sharp scent of ozone from the projector. Charlotte stood on the stage, her hand trembling as she gripped the podium. The footage on the screen behind her was undeniable, the raw, grainy footage of a pilot in a flight helmet, eyes focused, hands steady on the cyclic. It wasn't the face of a social media star. It was the face of the woman currently sitting at the back of the room in a dress that cost less than the antagonist's shoes. Charlotte forced a laugh, a high, brittle sound that set teeth on edge. "Well," she chirped into the microphone, the feedback whining like a wounded animal. "It seems my team accidentally included some B-roll from the official rescue archives. A little tribute to the entire crew, right?" She scanned the crowd, her eyes wide and pleading. She was looking for an out, a way to spin the truth back into the web of lies she had spent months weaving. Her gaze landed on Ethan Foster. He wasn't looking at her with his usual adoration. He was staring at the screen, his jaw tight, his brow furrowed in a way that suggested the scales were finally falling from his eyes. Elaine Foster didn't move. She didn't stand up to claim the glory, nor did she shrink away in shame. She simply sat there, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. The condensation was cold, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the ballroom. She could feel the weight of Walter Henderson's stare from across the room. The old man wasn't looking at the screen anymore. He was looking at her, a slow, knowing nod being the only sign that he recognized the pilot who had pulled his grandson from the wreckage. "Elaine," a voice hissed. She looked up to find Mrs. Foster leaning over her, her face a mask of panicked composure. "Go up there," her mother whispered, her perfume cloying and sweet. "Go up there and tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you were just the co-pilot. Charlotte's brand is at stake, Elaine. Think of the family." She felt a familiar spark of cold fire in her chest. For years, she had been the shadow, the silent support beam holding up the crumbling facade of her sister's ego. She looked at her mother, seeing the desperation in the woman's eyes, the fear not for the truth, but for the loss of the lifestyle the bully's lies provided. "The truth doesn't need a co-pilot, Mother," she said, her voice barely a whisper but cutting through the noise. On stage, Charlotte was doubling down. She began a frantic story about how she had been in the cockpit providing moral support and navigation, her hands gesturing wildly, the diamonds on her wrists catching the light. It was a pathetic display of entitlement. She actually believed that if she said it loud enough, the footage would change. 10 minutes later, the gala dissolved into a murmur of confused socialites. Elaine retreated to the quiet of the terrace, the night air smelling of damp earth and distant rain. The glass doors creaked open behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The sharp, rhythmic click of designer heels on the stone was as distinctive as a snake's rattle. "You did this on purpose," Charlotte spat. She slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the empty space. Her face was flushed, her perfect makeup beginning to crack under the strain of her rage. "You switched the files. You wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone." "I didn't switch anything," Elaine replied, her voice as calm as the eye of a hurricane. I just stopped hiding the files you stole from my laptop. If you're going to build a life on someone else's work, you should at least make sure you own the copyright. The younger woman stepped into her space, the scent of expensive champagne and frantic sweat radiating off her. Do you have any idea what you've done? I have 3 brand deals pending. I have 1 million followers waiting for the Heroes Gala post. You're a pilot, Elaine. You're a glorified bus driver in the sky. I'm a brand. People need me to be this person. The person who leaves a child in a blizzard, she asked, finally turning to face her sister. Because that's what the rest of that footage shows. It shows the person who refused to get out of the helicopter because the wind would ruin her hair. Charlotte flinched as if she'd been slapped. Her eyes darted toward the door, checking for witnesses. No one will believe you. It's your word against mine, and look at you. You're nothing. You're the sister who lives in a cramped apartment and smells like jet fuel. Elaine stepped closer, her height advantage making the other woman shrink back against the stone railing. She reached out and adjusted the strap of her sister's gown, a gesture that was terrifyingly maternal. You think this was the reveal? She asked, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. This was just the weather report. The storm is still coming. And you're standing on a very thin piece of ice. What is that supposed to mean? Charlotte demanded, her voice cracking. She didn't answer. She simply turned and walked toward the doors. As she passed the shadows near the entrance, she saw Ethan standing there. He was motionless, his face half hidden in the dark, but his eyes were fixed on his wife with a look of pure, unadulterated realization. Elaine didn't stop. She had a flight log to verify and a meeting with Walter's lawyers in the morning. The countdown hadn't ended. It had just shifted to a different frequency. Tomorrow, the board of directors would be meeting, and she held the only key to the hangar. The scent of expensive mahogany polish and sharp citrus cleaner hung heavy in the executive boardroom of Foster Aviation. It was a room designed to intimidate, all floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the private hangars, and heavy, high-backed leather chairs that swallowed anyone who didn't sit with perfect posture. Charlotte Foster was currently draped in the chair at the head of the table, her fingers tapping a rhythmic, impatient beat against the polished wood. She wore a cream-colored power suit that cost more than a year's fuel for a rescue chopper, and her hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe ponytail. The lighting is all wrong, she snapped, gesturing toward the windows. When the board members walk in, I need the sun behind me. It creates a halo effect. Ethan, move the chair 2 inches to the left. Ethan Foster didn't move. He stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the tarmac below where a small, battered search and rescue plane sat parked far away from the gleaming corporate jets. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 48 hours. His tie was slightly crooked, and the usual spark of arrogance in his eyes had been replaced by a hollow, flickering uncertainty. Ethan, Charlotte prompted, her voice sharpening. Are you even listening? This is the most important meeting of our lives. Once the board approves the Face of the Skies initiative, we won't just be running a company. We'll be a brand, a legacy. I saw her, Charlotte, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. Last night, at the gala, the way she looked at us, it wasn't the look of someone who's been beaten. Charlotte rolled her eyes, the movement fluid and practiced. Elaine, please. She's a pilot who plays in the snow for pennies. She was probably just bitter that her dress was 3 seasons old. Mother, tell him he's being ridiculous. Mrs. Foster looked up from her tablet, where she was busy approving social media captions for Charlotte's next post. He's just tired, darling, and Elaine has always had a way of being dramatic. She's probably just trying to ruin your big day because she has nothing of her own. She reached out, patting Charlotte's hand with a maternal pride that felt clinical. Don't let her shadow dim your light. Today is about the success you've built. The heavy double doors at the end of the room swung open, and Walter Henderson stepped inside. The retired veteran moved with a stiff, military precision that commanded immediate silence. He didn't look at the coffee service or the expensive catering trays. His eyes, sharp and judgmental, swept the room before settling on the woman at the head of the table. Mr. Henderson, Charlotte said, her voice instantly shifting into a melodic, professional tone. She rose from her seat, extending a hand. "It's an honor. I've prepared a full presentation on how we can modernize the Foster legacy through my new charitable foundation." Walter didn't take her hand. He simply pulled out a chair halfway down the table and sat. "I'm not here for a foundation, Charlotte. I'm here for the truth of this company's operations. The board has received, let's call it a notification of discrepancy." Charlotte's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. "Discrepancy? I'm sure it's just a clerical error. My team is very thorough." "We'll see," Walter replied, his voice like grinding stones. A moment later, the remaining 4 board members filed in, their faces grim. They took their seats in a silence so thick it felt physical. The only sound was the faint clink of glass as a secretary poured water into a pitcher, the cold condensation slicking the surface. Then, the door opened one last time. Elaine Foster walked in. She wasn't wearing the stained flight suit or the modest, borrowed dress from the night before. She wore a charcoal gray tailored suit that fit her with military precision. In her hand, she carried a weathered, leather-bound flight log and a thick manila folder embossed with a legal seal. She didn't look for a seat in the corner. She walked straight to the table, her heels clicking with a steady, relentless rhythm against the marble floor. "What are you doing here?" Charlotte's voice was a hissed command. She stood up, her knuckles white as she leaned against the table. "This is a closed board meeting. Security." Elaine didn't flinch. She pulled out a chair directly opposite Walter Henderson and set her folder down with a soft, deliberate thud. "I'm here as a primary stakeholder and the chief of flight operations for the northern sector," she said, her voice calm, level, and utterly devoid of the warmth she usually reserved for her family. "Chief of?" Charlotte let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "You're a contract pilot, Elaine. You're an employee, and a replaceable one at that. Get out before I have you escorted to the parking lot." "Actually," Walter interrupted, his voice cutting through Charlotte's outburst, "she's here at my invitation. And considering she's the one who actually holds the certifications for 70% of this company's government contracts, I suggest you sit down." The color began to drain from Charlotte's cheeks, leaving her blush looking like a bruise. She looked at Ethan, silently demanding he do something, but he was staring at the flight log in Elaine's hand as if it were a live grenade. "This is a joke," Charlotte stammered, turning back to the board. "Elaine has always been jealous. She's trying to sabotage the Face of the Sky's launch because she knows she doesn't have the image for it. She's a mechanic with a license, nothing more." Elaine leaned forward, the movement slow and predatory. She opened the flight log to a specific page, one marked with a red tab. "You've spent 3 years telling the board that the Foster family's charitable flight hours were logged by your specialized team. You've used those hours to claim millions in tax credits and to build your personal brand as a philanthropist." "Because I did," Charlotte snapped. "I organized those flights, I directed the resources." "No," Elaine said, her voice dropping to a dangerous register. "You didn't. This log contains the GPS coordinates, the tail numbers, and the pilot signatures for every single one of those missions. Every blizzard rescue, every medical transport, every emergency supply drop." She slid the book across the table toward Walter. "There is only one signature on those logs for the last 36 months. And it isn't yours, Charlotte." The room went deathly quiet. One of the board members, a woman who had known the Fosters for decades, leaned forward to look at the book. She looked at the signatures, then up at Elaine, her expression shifting from confusion to a dawning, horrified realization. Charlotte's chest was heaving now, the fabric of her expensive suit straining. Signatures can be faked. She's been sitting in those hangars for years, bitter and alone. She probably spent all night forging those. "I'm sure the FAA investigators will be able to determine that," Elaine replied. She reached into her folder and pulled out a digital recorder, placing it in the center of the table. "But before we get to the logs, I think we should talk about the Face of the Sky's budget. Specifically, the $3 million diverted from the maintenance fund for the rescue fleet to pay for your influencer retreat in the Maldives." Ethan made a small, choking sound. Mrs. Foster stood up, her face pale. Elaine, honey, let's talk about this outside. This is family business. We don't need to do this in front of the board. Family? Elaine finally let a small, cold smile touch her lips. It was a look of pure, unadulterated power. You stopped being my family the moment you sold my safety for a headline. Today, I'm just a shareholder looking at a very bad investment. She looked at Charlotte, whose mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water, her carefully constructed world beginning to fracture in the silent, judgmental gaze of the board. Go ahead, Charlotte, Elaine said softly. Give your presentation. I'm dying to hear how you're going to explain why the Blizzard Angels plane hasn't had an engine overhaul in 2 years while you were buying a second vacation home. Charlotte looked down at her notes, her hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. The countdown hadn't just ended. The explosion had already begun. The boardroom was silent, save for the hum of the overhead projector's cooling fan, a low, mechanical drone that seemed to vibrate through the very mahogany of the table. Charlotte stood paralyzed behind her laptop, the glow of the screen casting a ghoulish blue light over her features. She looked like a statue of a woman who had forgotten how to breathe. I'm sure there's a rational explanation, Mrs. Foster stammered, her voice thin and reedy as she reached out to grab Elaine's sleeve. Elaine, you're being impulsive. You're upset about the inheritance, but to accuse your sister of financial impropriety in front of these gentlemen. Elaine didn't pull away. She didn't have to. She simply turned her gaze toward her mother, and the older woman's hand dropped as if she'd touched a live wire. There was no heat in Elaine's eyes, only the glacial, terrifying calm of the high altitudes she called home. It's not an accusation, she said, her voice cutting through the cloying scent of Charlotte's expensive vanilla perfume. It's an audit. She reached into the leather portfolio she'd brought and pulled out a stack of documents, sliding them across the polished wood toward Walter Henderson. The retired veteran took them, his heavy silver eyebrows knitting together as he scanned the first page. These are the maintenance logs for the Blizzard Angels' primary rescue craft, Elaine explained, her tone as clinical as a surgeon-ess. And these are the corresponding invoices Charlotte submitted to the Foster Foundation for engine overhauls and safety upgrades. You'll notice the serial numbers on the invoices don't exist in any manufacturer's database. The money, nearly $400,000 over 18 months, was routed through a shell company registered to a vacation property in Aspen. That's a lie, Charlotte finally found her voice, though it came out as a shrill, desperate rasp. She lunged toward the table, her manicured nails scratching against the wood. She's unstable. She's been jealous of my success since we were children. She's trying to sabotage the brand because she has nothing of her own. Charlotte's face underwent a violent transformation as Walter flipped to the final page of the report. The carefully applied porcelain foundation couldn't hide the sudden, jagged bloom of crimson creeping up her throat, a mottled rash of pure panic. Her lower lip, usually curled in a practiced, photogenic pout, began to tremble with a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch that she couldn't suppress even as she tried to sneer. Her eyes widened until the whites were visible all the way around the irises, fixed on the documents as if staring into a physical abyss. The polished, media-ready mask didn't just slip, it shattered, leaving her features slack, raw, and aged by a decade of terror in a single heartbeat. Her breath came in shallow, jagged hitches that rattled in the silence of the room. Ethan sat frozen beside her, his hand halfway to his tie, his gaze darting between his wife's trembling form and the undeniable proof of her fraud. The realization seemed to hit him like a physical blow. The luxury cars, the designer clothes, the effortless life, it hadn't been built on influencer deals. It had been stolen from the very person Charlotte publicly claimed to champion. Walter, Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. Is it true? Walter Henderson didn't look up. He closed the folder with a sharp, final thud that echoed like a gunshot. The numbers don't lie, son, but there's something else here. He looked at Elaine, a new, profound respect softening his weathered face. The flight logs, the pilot's signature on the emergency landing in the Yukon 3 months ago. the one Charlotte claimed she coordinated from the ground. Elaine reached into her pocket. The metal was cold against her palm, a familiar weight that grounded her. She pulled out a small, tarnished silver object and set it on the table. It slid across the mahogany, coming to rest directly in front of Charlotte's shaking hands. It was a set of pilot's wings, the silver worn smooth at the edges from years of being tucked into a flight suit. In the center was the unique insignia of the Northern Rescue Division, the Blizzard Angel's mark. "You spent 3 years selling the story of a hero you never even bothered to meet," Elaine said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a shout. She stood up, smoothing her modest coat, her presence suddenly dwarfing everyone else in the room. "You built a career on my sweat and my risks, Charlotte. You called me a charity case while you were stealing the fuel out of my engines to pay for your jewelry." The woman at the far end of the table, a shark-eyed venture capitalist who had been silent until now, closed her laptop with a sharp click. "The board will be moving for a full forensic accounting, effective immediately. Security is waiting in the hall to escort you out, Charlotte. I suggest you find a very good lawyer." Charlotte sank into her chair, her body appearing to deflate as the witnesses, the men and women she had spent years courting, visibly recoiled, shifting their chairs away from her as if she were contagious. Elaine didn't stay to watch the tears. She didn't need the satisfaction of the breakdown. She had already reclaimed the only thing that mattered. "The plane is grounded, Charlotte," she said, turning toward the door. "And so are you." She walked out of the boardroom without looking back, the rhythmic click of her boots on the marble floor the only sound in the wake of the explosion she had left behind. In her pocket, her phone buzzed with a message from B, but she ignored it. The countdown was over. The storm had arrived. The lobby of Foster International felt like a refrigerated tomb. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic clicking of Elaine Foster's boots as she crossed the polished marble toward the exit. Behind her, the heavy brass doors of the boardroom remained closed, but the shockwaves from within were already vibrating through the building's glass bones. She could smell the ozone in the air, the scent of a storm finally breaking after years of oppressive heat. She was nearly to the revolving doors when the elevator chimed, a sharp, digital cry that cut through the stillness. The doors slid open to reveal a scene of frantic, ugly desperation. Charlotte Foster stumbled out, her face a mask of smeared mascara and raw, jagged fury. She wasn't the polished influencer the world knew. She was a woman coming apart at the seams. 2 security guards followed at a distance, their expressions stoic, their presence a silent testimony to her fall. "You think you can just walk away?" Charlotte's voice was a shrill, serrated edge that echoed off the high ceilings. "After what you did, you sabotaged me, you forged those documents." Elaine stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She felt the weight of the phone in her pocket, the screen still dark, and the cold draft from the street beginning to swirl around her ankles. When she finally turned, her expression was as calm as a frozen lake. "The forensic accountants won't find forgeries, Charlotte," she said, her voice low and steady. "They'll find the truth you've been burying under filters and lies for a decade." "Elaine, stop this." Mrs. Foster emerged from the shadows of the lobby lounge, her designer handbag clutched to her chest like a shield. Her face was pale, her lips trembling with the indignation of someone who had spent a lifetime protecting a beautiful lie. She rushed to Charlotte's side, placing a protective arm around her. "How could you do this to your sister? In front of the board? You've humiliated this family. You've destroyed everything we built." "No," Elaine replied, her gaze shifting to her mother. "You built a pedestal for a thief. I just stopped holding it up." Ethan Foster stood near the reception desk, his tall frame leaning against the wood as if he could no longer support his own weight. He looked at Charlotte as if seeing a stranger, his eyes darting from her trembling hands to the security guards. The realization was visible on his face, the slow, agonizing death of his respect for the woman he had married. He had been the witness to every small cruelty, every dismissive comment Charlotte had hurled at Elaine, and now the bill had come due. "Ethan, tell her." Charlotte screamed, grabbing his arm. "Tell her she's lying. Tell them all." Ethan didn't move. He didn't even flinch. "I saw the signatures, Charlotte. I recognize your handwriting. I recognized it even when I was trying to convince myself I was wrong." The lobby doors hissed open, and a new figure stepped into the fray. Walter Henderson moved with a deliberate, heavy gait, his silver-topped cane striking the marble with a sound like a gavel. The retired veteran looked around the room, his eyes settling on Charlotte with a cold, piercing clarity that made her flinch. "The board called me," Walter said, his voice carrying the gravelly authority of a man who had commanded battalions. They wanted to know if the heroism Charlotte claimed in the blizzard was as documented as her finances. Charlotte's features didn't just fall, they seemed to dissolve. The carefully applied porcelain foundation cracked around her mouth as it hung open, a silent, jagged O of disbelief. Her eyes, usually sharpened by calculated malice, became watery and unfocused, darting frantically like a trapped animal seeking a hole that didn't exist. The vibrant flush of her anger vanished, replaced by a sickly gray pallor that started at her throat and climbed to her hairline. Her shoulders, once held with the rigid posture of someone who owned the world, slumped forward until she looked small, withered, and entirely hollow. It was the look of a woman who had finally realized the floor wasn't just shaking, it was gone. "I told them the truth," Walter continued, stepping closer to Elaine. "I told them about the pilot who flew into a whiteout while everyone else was grounded. I told them about the Blizzard Angel who saved my grandson while you were busy taking selfies in a heated lodge, Charlotte." A collective gasp rippled through the lobby staff who had gathered near the periphery. The witnesses, the receptionists, the couriers, the security team, all stared at Charlotte with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. The social currency she had traded in for years had officially hit zero. Mrs. Foster tried to speak, but the words died in her throat as Walter turned his gaze toward her. "And you," he said, his voice dropping an octave. You knew which daughter was the hero, and you let the other one steal the crown because it looked better on camera." Charlotte sank to her knees, the silk of her expensive skirt pooling on the cold marble. She looked up at Elaine, her voice a broken whisper. "You're going to leave me with nothing, after everything I did for this family's image." Elaine looked down at her, and for the first time in years she felt nothing. No anger, no resentment, just a profound sense of finality. The secret power she had held, the truth of her own worth, was no longer a secret. It was the only thing left standing in the room. "I didn't take your life, Charlotte," Elaine said, her voice a calm hum against the backdrop of the rising wind outside. "I just stopped lending you mine. You have 30 minutes to clear your personal items before the auditors lock the doors." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't stay to watch Ethan walk away from the woman he no longer knew, or to see Mrs. Foster try to pick up the pieces of a shattered reputation. Elaine turned and walked through the revolving doors, stepping out into the biting chill of the evening. The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and cleansing. As she reached her car, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from B***. The coordinates are set. The world knows the name of the pilot now. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Elaine looked back at the towering glass monolith of Foster International. The lights on the top floor were flickering out, one by one, as the empire she had sustained finally went dark. She climbed into the driver's seat, the engine purring to life, a low growl of freedom. She had reclaimed her name, but as the storm broke over the city, she knew the reckoning was only beginning. The fallout would reach further than the boardroom, and there were still shadows in her past that the light of this victory hadn't yet reached. She shifted into gear and drove into the rain, leaving the wreckage of the Foster legacy in her rearview mirror. 6 months had passed since the glass towers of the city had blurred into a rain-streaked memory in Elaine Foster's rearview mirror. The air in Talkeetna was different. It didn't smell of exhaust or expensive, suffocating perfumes. It smelled of ancient ice, resinous spruce, and the sharp, chemical tang of high-octane aviation fuel. Elaine stood on the tarmac, her boots crunching on a thin crust of morning frost. She wasn't wearing a cocktail dress or a borrowed silk scarf today. She wore a heavy flight suit, grease-stained at the knees, and a pair of rugged aviators that shielded her eyes from the blinding glare of the sun bouncing off the Alaska range. Behind her, the twin-engine otter hummed with a rhythmic, healthy thrum, its propellers slicing through the frigid air like a promise kept. Walter Henderson walked toward her from the small operations shack, his breath blooming in white plumes. He looked younger than he had during those frantic days in the boardroom. The weight of his grandson's debt had been replaced by a quiet, fierce loyalty that had become the backbone of Elaine's new life. He handed her a steaming thermos, his grip firm. "The weather window is holding," Walter said, nodding toward the jagged white teeth of the horizon. "The crew at the North Base is ready for the supplies. They're calling you the Queen of the High Latitudes now, you know. The Blizzard Angel moniker finally went public." Elaine took a sip of the bitter, black coffee, feeling its heat spread through her chest. "I just like the silence up there, Walter. No one asks for my credentials when I'm 10,000 feet up." "They don't have to," he replied softly. "Your name is on the hanger now, the real one." He handed her a folded newspaper, a tabloid from the city she had left behind. It was a month old, but the ink still felt like a stain. On the third page, a grainy photo showed a woman standing outside a cramped, beige apartment complex in a suburb that didn't even have a zip code worth mentioning. Charlotte Foster looked unrecognizable. Her signature platinum hair was gone, replaced by a dull, mousy brown that hadn't seen a professional stylist in months. She was carrying a plastic bag of groceries, her shoulders hunched as if trying to hide from the very cameras she once craved. The caption detailed the finality of the fraud settlement. The influencers had moved on to fresher meat, and the Foster lifestyle brand had been liquidated to pay the legal fees of the victims she'd stepped on. She was working at a local dry cleaner now, spending her days scrubbing the stains out of other people's designer clothes. The same clothes she used to claim were beneath her. Elaine felt a flicker of the old coldness, but it didn't burn. It was just a fact. The woman who had poured wine over her and called her a servant was now living a life of invisible, grueling labor. There was no one left to perform for. Ethan Foster had filed for divorce the week after the board meeting, citing irreconcilable differences and a sudden, sharp clarity about his wife's character. He had sent Elaine a single letter, an apology that she had burned without reading. Some bridges were better left as ash. "Have you heard from your mother?" Walter asked, his voice cautious. Elaine looked away, toward the mountain. Mrs. Foster had refused to see her. The matriarch was living in a small, two-bedroom condo funded by a dwindling annuity, still clinging to the delusion that Charlotte was the victim of a grand conspiracy. She spent her evenings calling old friends who no longer picked up the phone, a ghost in a house of cards that had finally collapsed. "The silence is her answer," Elaine said. It was the cost of the truth. She had reclaimed her dignity, but she had lost the mother she'd spent 30 years trying to earn. It was a fair trade, though the price still ached on particularly quiet nights. A radio crackled from the cockpit. "Rescue 1, you are cleared for departure." Elaine handed the paper back to Walter. She didn't need the reminder of the wreckage she'd left behind. She climbed into the pilot's seat, the familiar vibration of the airframe settling into her bones. This was her throne. The instrument panel glowed with a steady, reliable light, a stark contrast to the flickering shadows of the corporate world. She taxied to the end of the runway, the vastness of the wilderness stretching out before her. As she pushed the throttle forward, the roar of the engines drowned out the lingering whispers of the past. The plane lifted, the wheels leaving the frozen earth, and for a moment, she was suspended between the world she had broken and the one she was building. Far below, the shadows of the mountains stretched long and dark, but above, the sky was a piercing, endless blue. Elaine Foster banked the plane toward the north, disappearing into the light of the high peaks. She was no longer the girl in the corner or the secret hero in the shadows. She was exactly where she belonged, flying high above the ruins of a legacy that had never been hers to carry. The sky was clear, the wind was at her back, and for the first time in her life she was completely, terrifyingly free.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.